Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. This week's podcast focuses on wool. I have tidbits and some interesting wool acquisitions that I have big plans for this summer. So let's get started. When I come across something I think would be a good tidbit, or when someone sends me a link to an interesting article or video as a suggestion for a tidbit, I file it away in a little database I have where I make a note of who sent it to me or where I came across it myself, and then a brief description of what it is and the link to the thing, whether it's a website or a video or something else. But this first tidbit, I have no idea where I came across it. It came to me sometime in the past week, and I left it in an open tab on my browser, but I have no clue on how I came across it. I didn't enter it into the tidbit database, so I have no notes about where it came from. So if this was something that one of you sent me, thank you, and I'm really sorry I don't have a record for it so that I can give you credit. The tidbit is a blog post on a website called Modern Farmer, and it's about 8 breeds of what are called hair sheep. Now, these are sheep that don't need to be sheared in the spring because they shed their winter coats as many other wild animals do. Domesticated sheep were bred thousands of years ago so that they wouldn't shed and that their fleece would be easier to harvest all at once. The cost of shearing a sheep can sometimes outweigh the return on the money that you get from the wool. So farmers who aren't looking to raise sheep for their wool might find benefits in raising hair sheep, whether it's because they want to raise them for meat or because of their ability to keep brush under control. A few months back, I shared a tidbit about how sheep were being brought back to the site of Pompeii after having been banned for the past several decades. Because where sheep eat, they also poop, and the person in charge of taking care of the Pompeii land thought it was a nuisance to have to deal with the manure, that it was dirty and smelly, and that tourists wouldn't like it. The problem was that without sheep keeping the land clear, the brush became overgrown with the roots growing down into the ruins that were below ground and that hadn't yet been excavated. So they brought the sheep back to Pompeii in order to keep that brush under control on the surface and thus protecting the ruins underneath the ground. So in this Modern Farmer article, they're talking about 8 different hair sheep breeds and the qualities of those sheep and what they might be used for, particularly when it comes to clearing brush. So I will leave a link to that article down in the show notes. This tidbit came up in my Twitter feed. It's an article from, I'm going to say it's pronounced Hakai or Hakai magazine, and the name of the article is called No Wool, No Vikings, the fleece that launched 1,000 ships. One of the barriers to ocean exploration was the amount of labor and fiber required to produce sails. If you think about fiber as a resource to produce clothing, which was considered extremely valuable prior to the Industrial Revolution, and the fact that back then every inch of yarn and thread had to be spun on spindles before it could be woven into cloth. You can understand why using that precious fiber and cloth for something other than clothing would be a pretty serious undertaking in terms of the labor, but also the loss of its use for clothing. So the article that I will link to down in the show notes talks about these huge square Viking sails and the fact that they were made from wool, which I found surprising, and I think a lot of people have found surprising. But they explained that the wool fabric was covered with this sort of waxy resin that helped keep it from just, letting the wind blow right through it. But what was astounding is how much wool would be needed to create those sails, like literally tons of it for the sales for a single ship, which could amount to the entire year's production of wool. That's being used in favor of being used for clothing. So there is a group of students who are learning about these traditional methods that were used to create the sails, starting with the sheep that provided the wool. So these sheep are left to their own devices most of the year. They're dual-coated sheep. So they have this sort of outer coat that protects them from rain and wind, and then this warm, downy undercoat. And these sheep are not shorn, but instead they are rude, meaning that the wool is plucked from them. I'm still trying to work out if these types of dual-coated sheep are considered hair sheep, which I talked to in the previous tidbit, or if sheep that are rude are somewhere in between a hair sheep and one that has to be sheared. It's just not clear to me. I think that some of these sheep that can be rude are sometimes sheared instead if it's just more efficient. But I just don't really understand where these sheep are on kind of the spectrum of sheep. So my assumption, and I could be very wrong here, is that it's the undercoat of a dual-coated sheep that is shed in the spring, because that's the coat that is grown for the winter months for the extra warmth. But it's possible that both coats are shed in the spring and a single coat maybe is grown for the summer. I just really don't know. I don't understand these dual-coated sheep and how they're related to hair sheep versus sheep that do need to be sheared. This is just one of those areas of understanding sheep where I'm realizing how much there is to learn and how much I just don't know or understand yet. So if anyone out there has a better understanding of these dual-coated sheep and sheep that need to be rude, and if dual-coated sheep are the same as sheep that need to be rude, or if there is some sort of various combinations of those. If you can point me to any resources so I can have a better understanding, I'd really appreciate that. And I will leave a link to that article about the Viking sails down in the show notes. This tidbit came to me through a presentation by McGill Library a few weeks back that combined botany books in their collections, which were written by women back in the 19th century, along with a knitting pattern that one of the librarians created that took an image of a plant from one of those botany books and then turned it into a stranded colorwork design. I talked about that lecture in Casual Friday 618, which was 2 weeks ago. So if you want to know more about that lecture, that's the episode where you can find that. But within that McGill lecture, they were talking about a book called Werner's Nomenclature of Colors. Actually, the title is quite a bit longer, as was common in the 19th century. It was actually called Werner's Nomenclature of Colors, with additions arranged so as to render it highly useful to the arts and sciences, particularly zoology, botany, chemistry, mineralogy, and morbid anatomy, annexed to which are examples selected from well-known objects in the animal, vegetable, and mineral kingdoms. What the book does is provide color images of specific colors, giving them a name, and then indicating what animal, vegetable, and mineral examples that there are in nature that have that particular color. So for example, on this page of reds, color 82 is called tile red, and that you'll be able to find that color on the breast of a cock bullfinch, in the shrubby pimpernel, and also in the porcelain jasper. So it's a fascinating resource for seeing a system of standardizing colors from 200 years ago. This book was published in 1821. And it's similar to what we see with Pantone colors in this digital age, where there's a system of here is the exact color and formula for creating that color. So you can actually read this book in its entirety on archive.org, and I will leave a link to that down in the show notes. Every year on Mother's Day weekend, we have what's called Shepherd's Harvest here in Minnesota. It's our local a fiber festival. And so I have been going for years. There was often a period of time where I kind of went every other year because I realized, well, I wasn't a spinner and I'm not really much of a yarn shopper. Like, I don't really build stash up because I typically can't figure out what to do with it. So it's grown over the years, but early on what it was a lot of raw fleece by shepherds selling their harvest. And then you'd see independent dyers. So they would have been buying commercially milled yarn that they would have dyed. And then you'll see people who are selling tools or baskets or various types of things that might appeal to people going to a fiber festival. And it has grown over the years. So back in 2018, I had made a goal for the year that I wanted to try knitting with a wider variety of wool breeds, because at my local yarn shops, I mostly could just find Peruvian Highland wool, which is what like the standard wool is that you'll find in a million colors in different yarn companies. You'll see merino. Some shops might carry Shetland wool. Occasionally you might see a BFL, blue-faced Leicester, certainly mohair, once in a while little balls of cashmere, but there just wasn't a lot of different wool breeds. And so I was making an effort when I'd go to a yarn shop to look for something else, and I just wasn't finding anything. And I thought, oh, maybe Shepherd's Harvest, that would be a place to find those kinds of yarns. Years before, I had bought some alpaca from an alpaca farmer. They had their alpaca milled into yarn, and I thought, oh, there would probably be a lot of other shepherds who do the same thing. That's how I can get these different types of yarns made from different wool breeds. And so I went to the festival that year expecting to be able to find that. And again, I was finding a lot of yarns that were indie dyed from superwash merino, not what I was interested in. Or there were bags of raw fleece, like plastic bags, and you could just see the wool through them. And they all kind of looked alike. And then you'd see vendors who were selling totally prepared wool that was ready to be spun, like in combed top or roving. And those pretty much all looked alike as well, unless they were dyed or they were a natural color or something. I just wasn't finding what I was looking for. Then I went into a booth where she was selling washed long locks in these 1 ounce sampler size. And so they were already washed and they were out on display, and just 1 ounce at a time, like tied with a ribbon. And that was when I really understood the variety of fleeces that you might find on different breeds. And so there was, some that were like 12 inches long and they looked like little ringlets. And then there were some that were just kind of wavy a little bit. I saw some Icelandic wool where I could see, oh, now I understand what they mean by two coats. You could see the downy and the really long overcoat, kind of guard hair fibers in the same lock. And I'm like, oh, I get it. And then there was something like Corriedale or something that was much shorter in length, but it was super, super crimpy. And I realized for me to really understand different wool breeds, I needed to not get a yarn that again, they basically all look alike. I needed to start with the wool so I could see how that transformed and I could experience it. I needed to learn to spin. And this was a shock to me. I've told this story before because I had made a vow back in 2005 when I kind of came back to knitting and I started the Master Hand Knitting program and I started encountering people who were spinners. I made a vow to not pay any attention to anything that had to do with spinning because I didn't want to get distracted from the Master Hand Knitting program. Well, I finished that in 2012, but I had this mindset of you are not going to learn anything about spinning. So it was at that Shepherd's Harvest back in 2018 where I have to learn to spin. And it kind of really shook me up. And so I took lessons at joined the Weavers Guild, took lessons in spinning, and I was kind of doing it sporadically after I first learned. And then in 2019, I went back to Shepherd's Harvest. I bought a couple of fleeces. I was really excited about it. And then, you know, it dropped off again. And I realized that for me, spinning wasn't really about starting with the raw wool and then ending up with a sweater or a pair of socks, which are the things that I tend to knit the most, but just understanding the wool. I didn't, you know, I am a person who I need to know what my project is, figure out what the project is, how I'm going to construct it, what are the techniques I'm going to use, what are the stitch patterns, and then what sort of yarn do I need to make that happen. And it always comes down to a solid worsted weight wool, because that's going to be something plain enough to make my ideas come to life. I just am not good at starting with the yarn. And the problem with spinning is you don't always know what yarn you're going to end up with. And then you have to figure out, you might be spinning a sweater's worth of yarn, but if it's not, it doesn't end up the way you expected, it might not work for the project that you had in mind. So I know that some people can really plan out their yarn and get what they want. I don't have that kind of experience yet. So what I did a couple of years ago was I bought a sampler pack of 1 ounce of 30 different breeds that were in combed tops. So they were already processed. I couldn't really see what the fleece looked like, but it gave me an opportunity to quickly rotate through one breed after the other and kind of get the spinning practice, but also just to see how differently the wools behave. If you watch my channel regularly, you will remember that earlier this spring, I knit all of those different 30 breeds into this sampler blanket so I can use it as kind of a reference. And like, what is Polworth like? Oh yeah, I remember that. Or what is this wool? What is that wool? So I finished this up just a few days before Shepherd's Harvest this year. I do enjoy going to Shepherd's Harvest. I like volunteering at the Minnesota Knitters Guild booth. And part of what you do when you're volunteering there is you bring in some knitted things to put on the table to attract people over there. And I thought, well, this blanket would be a perfect thing to bring there because there's going to be a lot of knitters and spinners, and they can look and compare all of these different wools. And I had also had in my mind, oh, going forward, you know, I haven't spun every kind of wool breed there is. I could always add to that as I came across other wools. And so my intent was to add to this blanket. My intent was not to buy anything at Shepherd's Harvest this year. I wanted to see how it had grown. I hadn't been there since throughout the pandemic. This was my first year back. It has grown over the years. I just wanted to experience it as sort of an event and not think about, oh, here's what I want to buy, because there was nothing I wanted to buy. Then I walked into a booth that said single breed yarns, and I thought, where were you in 2018? It was really interesting to see the different yarns she had. So she collects these, fleeces of different breeds, and then she takes them to a mill and she'll have them spun into yarn. And I thought, this is really cool. And she had some polypay, and I'm like, I've heard of polypay and I've seen them, but I haven't spun with it. I certainly haven't seen yarn made from it. It's really fun to see. I said, but I'm really looking more for, being able to start with the spinning. And she's like, I have some leftovers. Like when I take all of this wool to the mill and they don't necessarily use all of it to make the yarn, I take the leftover roving and then I sell it in 1 ounce balls. And I thought, that is perfect. And so then I'm like, oh, now I have a goal for Shepherd's Harvest. I will see about buying small amounts of different breeds of wool that I could add to my wool blanket. So I want to go to the overhead and I'll show you what I bought from her, but also what I bought from another booth. And then what I bought after that. This is what's called combed top. And this was commercially produced combed top. So whatever wool this was, it was scoured and it was carded on a giant, drum carder. And then it was like pin combed. So it was run through these sets of pins probably multiple times in order to straighten out and align all of the fibers. And you tend to get something that's, kind of like wider and flatter like this. And you can just see all of the fibers are lined up in here. So this is the kind of fiber that I was working with when I did the breed study. All 30 of those were combed top, 1 ounce of combed top. This wool has been carded, and this is called Clune Forest. And this is something I'd heard of, but I'd never seen. And so I thought, well, this would be great. I'd love to try spinning this. That would be something I could add to my breed study. So the Clune Forest is an area of Shropshire, England, very, very close to the Wales, the border of Wales, like right on the edge there. They are multi-purpose sheep, so they're bred for meat, milk, and fleece, a medium length staple. They have like a colored face, but the rest of their body is all white, so they don't have to worry about any coloring getting into the wool, so that makes it good for if you wanted to dye it or just use it in its natural color. Also doesn't have kemp. So kemp are those like hairs that are very kinky, and they will stick out. They don't cooperate, and they apparently don't dye. They don't take dye either. So their wool is really nice for hand spinning. So I'm looking forward to that. So this was the first booth I went in. So I was on a mission to find booths that were selling different types of breeds, so that I could try spinning those. I thought that's something I could look for here at Shepherd's Harvest. So then I came across the booth of Fiber Curio, and what she had was samplers, like 4 to 5 ounce Ziploc bags of raw fleece of rare breeds. And I thought, well, that is really interesting to me, because then I could actually see what the fleece looked like. Once it's been processed and into something a roving or top, you don't really have a sense of what the fleece originally looked like unless you look up a picture of the sheep, and you can kind of get a sense. So I really liked this as an option, being able to buy small quantities of really unusual different breeds. So this is Swedish Fennel or fine wool. I scoured this, so this has been washed, but you can still see what the original crimp looked like. And so there's still some, vegetable matter and dirt and stuff in there that I need to get out, and that will happen as I do the processing of this. That's one of the ones I got from Fiber Curio. The next one I got is called, it says on the bag, it says Rare Spitty Mutation of Valais Black-Nosed Lamb. So I have not scoured this, but you can see how different this looks than the fine wool looks. Like this is, a much more of a wavy wool, and you see how there's black mixed into it. So the black-nosed Valais sheep has been declared the world's cutest sheep, and I am not going to argue with that statement. What is meant by the rare spitty mutation, these are from Switzerland, so I think that must be the Swiss word for spotty, is spitty. So instead of just the face and like their little kneecaps being black, there are some that will be born that will have black throughout their body, and that's what this was. There's a couple of colors here. And again, the fleece looks different. It's a wavier one rather than super crimpy. So it's probably more of a medium type of a wool rather than a fine wool. And I can do a couple of different things with this when I experiment. I can separate out the black from the white. I can do some things where I blend some of it to maybe get a gray in between. And I can just experiment in a couple of different ways. I can also experiment with maybe a couple of different spinning methods depending on, this looks like a pretty long staple length. If you look at this, this is a pretty long staple. So this is probably best suited for spinning worsted. I could try a couple of different things. I might try combing some of this versus carding some of it, and then spinning it worsted, but seeing what the difference is in the end product. So with having 4 ounces like this to experiment with, and then a couple of different colors, that really opens up my options in terms of just sampling and trying things out and seeing what happens. I'd also be interested to see if there's a difference in the black fiber compared to the white fiber. See if there's any difference in texture at all as well. This bag is Norwegian Spelsau lamb. So this, I've got 5.4 ounces of this. And again, there is multiple colors. But what's interesting about this one is that it's a dual coated fleece. I had just, like a week or two prior to finding this, I had watched Tiny Fiber Studio, Beck's. She had some Kiviot that was raw that she bought at a fiber show. And the Kiviot has 4 different coats. So she did a whole video on separating out the different coats. So a wool like this is dual coated, so it's got the longer guard hairs and then it's got the soft downy stuff underneath. If it was sent to a commercial mill, they would do what they call a dehairing process to separate those two out. So this is another interesting experiment where I can separate them out and I can spin each type of the coat separately. And there's also some colors, so I could do some experiments with blending or separating out colors. What the woman at Fiber Curio said was that this undercoat is nearly the same length as the outer coat, and so that I could spin them together, and that the shepherd had recommended spinning from the locks. So washing the locks and then, you know, opening the locks up so that they could be spun and then spinning both coats together. She said that carding it might damage the under coat. So that's something that I need to think about, but I've got enough of it here that I can do, again, several experiments where I do try carding or seeing if I can card them when they're separate or what, but I have enough to do that, and I have not scoured this yet either. The other name for this in English would be Old Norwegian Short-tailed sheep. So it's possibly the original sheep breed of Norway. So these short-tailed sheep were probably what was originally when people were migrating into Northern Europe and they brought sheep with them, they brought these short-tailed sheep. So you'll find them in Norway and I think the UK. Well, Shetland sheep are a short-tailed sheep. I think Greenland is another place. So these were the original type of sheep. They're very hardy. They can handle these tough climates, but they're small. And so over time, what became favored were larger long-tailed sheep that could produce, more meat or more fleece or whatever. It's really great to be able to have some of the wool from a sheep like that. So then after I bought my wools, I went back to the guild booth and I was talking to people for the next few hours, and a woman came up who I recognized. And, if you go to a lot of knitting events in the Twin Cities, you see the same people, but you don't always know, I don't always know, where do I know them from? Are they from the guild? Did I teach them in a class once? Did I take a class with them? I don't necessarily know. And she recognized me from when I was teaching at Needlework Unlimited, but I was showing her what I had bought, all these different samplers. And she told me about a friend of hers who's been in Norway, I think for 20 or 30 years, and who is working to bring back some rare breeds of sheep. So let's go back to the overhead and I'll show you some more wool that I got from Norway. I ripped open this package because I thought I was recording and I wasn't. So I have not opened this yet. This is from Selbu Spinnery. What I ordered was some different colors of a Norwegian gray Tronder sheep. So this is a really rare breed of domesticated sheep that originated from crossbreeding some of the native, what they call landrace sheep, with another sheep that's extinct called a Tautra sheep. And they did that in the late 19th century. There's only about 50 of these sheep left, according to Wikipedia. And so the woman at Selbu Spinnery, she's trying to bring these sheep back. So let's see what's inside. I ordered this just a couple of days, like maybe a day or two after Shepherd's Harvest. What they do is they scour to order. So when you order something, they scour it, and so it takes about a week before they even ship it, and then it took, a few weeks before it got here. So it got here earlier in the week, and I just hadn't opened it. So this one says Mellum Gray. I'm going to at least gray. So I'm assuming this is light gray, medium gray, and this one must be the dark one right here. And then I ordered another one that's, I think, a different sheep. It's a Blazet sow. So I think the sow means sheep. So this has been scoured, so I don't have to go through that, but I can see what the crimp is like. I can see what the wool actually looks like in here. So this is the light gray. It's very soft. So it feels like, I mean, it's not soft like merino, I don't think, but it is soft. So this will be interesting, and it's nice to see, you know, what the crimp looks like. So this is the light gray. This is the medium. Be interesting to maybe do a gradient of them. So then this is the medium, which seems pretty dark. Oh, yes. And then this is dark. I don't know if you can tell. Yeah, this is really dark right here. So that's, oh my gosh, look how dark that is. I would call that black. So those are the three colors of these rare Norwegian sheep. And then this is, oh, I don't know what color. This is, this looks more brown to me, this one. This is a different breed than this. I'll put a picture of this sheep. But again, this feels, it feels nice to the touch, even with, you know, there's still vegetable matter in it. And so this will be interesting to experiment with, and I'm going to have to find a way to make sure I keep these all separate. But yeah, this is, I would call this almost like a true black. Look how dark that is. And then this almost looks like what you'd see off of a sheep that they would say is black, but it's actually a really deep, deep, dark chocolate brown. It's beautiful. Oh, I'm so excited about these, and I'm so glad I don't have to scour them myself. So ever since I started avoiding learning to spin, I have been aware that there's an event every July called Tour de Fleece that coincides with Tour de France. So the idea, it's a spinning challenge, so that you set a challenge for yourself, a personal challenge. It could be that you want to spin for, you know, 10 minutes every day, or it could be you want to process an entire fleece, or spin an entire sweater's quantity of yarn, whatever your challenge is for you. And the idea is to make it fun and not stressful. And it's just individual, whatever you want to do. But the idea is that every day that the cyclists are biking in Tour de France, then you are spinning for Tour de Fleece. And so I think there's 2 days that they get a break. So it's 21 days out of the 23 is for spinning. And people make up different teams. Like there's a whole Tour de Fleece Ravelry group, and they have a few moderated threads, like for rookies. Like if this is your first year doing Tour de Fleece, you can join the rookies team, and then there's a couple of other teams. And you're just sharing what your goals are and what you've done, what you've accomplished. So it's just something that it's like a community event. You're doing it with other people, but you're not competing with other people. And so the teams, people also form their own teams that they might have something in common. So there might be a local, you know, fiber shop that has a team for Tour de Fleece. And so everybody who goes to that shop or is using fleece from that shop could participate. And so some teams might have prizes that they do, but some of them aren't going to. And it's just, you make of it what you want. You don't have to join a team. You don't have to post anything. You can participate on your own without making anybody else aware of it. It's completely individual in that way. But my friend Elizabeth, who I went to the mill in Wisconsin back in April, and then we met up for Shepherd's Harvest. We were both there, and we went around. We had lunch together, and we did some exploring of the vendors together. I saw her last week at Worldwide Knit and Public Day, and she mentioned Tour de Fleece. And I said, oh, I was thinking about that, but I don't really understand it. And so she sent me some information so I could get a handle on what it is. So I've joined a couple of teams. I've joined the team that's in the Lendrum Lovers group on Ravelry. So I have a Lendrum spinning wheel, and so I'm a member of the Lendrum Lovers group, even though I don't really post there very often. But I can, put my progress on there, whatever I'm spinning on my Lendrum. There's another group called Raw Fleece Lovers, I think is the name of it. And since that is certainly something that I'm starting with, in some cases, I could show my progress on working with the fleece that started out raw when I got it. So there's just different ways to participate. You don't have to join teams. You can join multiple teams. You can join one team. You can join no teams. You don't, again, you can make of it what you want. So I have decided that this will be really helpful for me to help me make my goals, because I need motivators for when I want to do something and I want to make myself do it. I want to make myself do the things that I want to do. And so this sounds like a way for me to do it. And I also know that I'm not going to set unreasonable goals. So let me know down in the comments if you have done Tour de Fleece or if you're planning on doing it this year, and what your experience was like. It seems like it could be a fun way to get through some of this wool that I have acquired in the past month or so. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below. Or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.